Always got to be a little bit early. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome to the opening ceremony of the second annual Veterans Classic, where we honor our past and celebrate our future. I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Don Denny of the Vimy Branch, the Royal Canadian Legion. The roots of today's event stretch all the way back to the opening of the Western Fair in 1867. Since then, the fair has cultivated deep military roots, and the historical linkage to horses is equally significant. For instance, from 1914 to 1918, more than 50,000 horses sold here at horse auctions were destined for duty during World War I. After World War II, the Warriors' Day Parade became an annual event that, across the decades, maintained that relationship with the military while reflecting the fair's commitment to supporting veterans. Today, in touch with Canadian society and lifestyles, the Warriors' Day has now evolved into a vibrant new event, the Veterans Classic, an annual standard-bred racing event that celebrates the sport while commemorating the sacrifices of our veterans of all eras. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the colors carried by members of HMCS Prevost. Color Party, march on the colors. And now, let us all join Ireland St. Ange, finalist in this year's Rise to Fame competition, as she leads us in our national anthem. Ireland.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all thy sons command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
To describe the mounted troop display of Canada's famous cavalry, now known as an armoured regiment, please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Alan Finney, Commanding Officer of the 1st Hussars. Alan.
Thank you, Don. The 1st Hussars Mounted Troops started about 5 years ago as an idea here in London, Ontario, and has grown quite big. Currently we have about 16 riders, 3 of which you see in front of you today. They're all volunteers. They have been riding for many years. However, they've never done a military drill, precision drill, prior to being part of the cavalry troop. The members you see riding in front of you today had just come back from France, where we completed a remembrance ride for the 100th anniversary of the end of the war and the last 100 days. The ride took place starting the city of Cambrai, where the Canadians liberated in September of 1918, and moving through the very small villages, following the Canadian Corps up and into the final parade in the city of Mons, which Canada liberated on November 11th, 1918. In every one of the towns that we rode through, that we were part of the procession, the citizens of France and Belgium wanted to see the Canadian troops, the Canadian cavalry, as they rode through. It was a point of honor for us. We all wore the famous Stetson hat that you see the light horse wearing, as well as the RCMP here, who later bore it from the cavalry. We had 60 members from around the world take part in this ride. And we had members from the UK, Australia, Germany, Switzerland, and Russia. Riding through the towns, it was quite the honor to see the citizens, the young children come out who were remembering and learning about the First World War. A lot of times we talk about and remember the soldiers that fought, but we tend to forget, obviously, the horses that you see in front of you, but also the civilians that were in these towns that suffered 4 years behind enemy lines and were finally liberated in 1918. The riders in front of you, on your left, is Ted Jiggs riding Abe Lincoln, a quarter horse. We have in the middle is Ted Goff riding Ray J, who, yes, Ray J is a mule. And finally, we have Andy Thompson riding a Canadian horse. And Canadian horses are actually a Canadian-bred horse that have been in Canada since the 1600s, coming from the royal livery of France. They're wearing the uniform of the 1st Hussars from the First World War. When they were not in combat on duty, they would wear the Stetson as their soft hat. And on their left shoulder, as they go around, you'll see they wear the colors of the Canadian Light Horse, which are the blue, red, and gray, which represented the various divisions that the Canadian Light Horse supported. Currently, they're just going through some maneuvers to warm up the horses, and then near the end, they'll do some skill at arms with the sword and potentially the lance. We've been practicing this here today on this track. However, if you've ever ridden horses, you realize that every time you do something with a horse, he may surprise you and do something you don't expect. So we'll see how these guys do. They've been doing pretty good so far today. The First Hussars started in 1856 here in London, Ontario, and St. Thomas with the 1st Cavalry Troops in both those towns. In 1872, they were combined into one regiment, the 1st Regiment of Cavalry, and then in 1892, they became known as the 1st Hussars. We have fought in every significant conflict that Canada has participated in. We had members in the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, many of the peacekeeping operations, and most recently Afghanistan. We are a reserve unit, but in times the country calls us forward, we become a regular force and train on the current systems. In 1939, Canadian Light Horse, the 1st Hussars, had to give up their horses and take over the tanks of the Second World War, and are known for being part of the landing invasion in D-Day on Juno Beach in 1944 with their swimming duplex drive tanks. And they fought throughout the war, and many of you may have seen the Holy Roller up in Victoria Park, which is one of 2 Canadian tanks that fought through the war and returned to Canada. In the First World War, the Canadian Light Horse left from here, from London, Ontario, and went overseas to the United Kingdom. They established the training center in the UK for the Canadian Cavalry under the 7th Canadian Mounted Rifles, led by Lieutenant Colonel Ibbotson Leonard from London, Ontario. They stayed in London, Ontario for a number of years. They stayed in England for about 6 months, and in 1916 they went to France as the Canadian Corps Cavalry Regiment with 3 squadrons. The first squadron was from the 19th Alberta Light Horse, second squadron from the 1st Hussars, and the third squadron from the 16th Canadian Light Horse. In 1918, in October, we actually had a fourth squadron added to the unit, which was actually members from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. On March of 1917, the Canadian Corps Cavalry Regiment became known as the Canadian Light Horse and took part in the battles at Vimy Ridge. And moving forward, after the ridge was secured, they went forward of the front lines for about 7 kilometers on a recce, and they came across German counterattacks. And by being in that position in front of the enemy friendly lines, they were able to actually stymie that attack and prevent an attack on the Canadian positions, allow us to secure Vimy Ridge. Throughout the next few years in combat, they did many roles that the Canadian reconnaissance units do today, such as route reconnaissance, area reconnaissance, rear area security, passing messages on between the front lines and rear lines in communications. In 1918, they took part as the Canadian Light Horse for the very first time as a regiment in combat from August 1918 to October 1918. On the 9th of October 1918, they took part in one of the final cavalry charges of the Canadian Cavalry in the small town of Ivry in France. As it was described by the troop leader at the time, he was moving forward with his troop of 25 horses and came across Germans that were actually dug in and waiting. Both were surprised. He managed to charge 25 of the Germans and take them prisoner. While his troops were taking them prisoner, he went forward to the next crest line and looked over, and he describes he saw a battalion of Germans preparing for lunch. He was quite surprised that they were not actually warned by the combat. He managed to get most of his soldiers up in a spread out line, charged the German position, and actually captured that unit and went on to the next crest line. He was able to hold that position for 6 hours, stopping German counterattacks, and was relieved that night. The next day, on the 10th of October, 1918, A and C squadrons of the Canadian Light Horse conducted further charges onto the flank of the town of Ivry, but were unsuccessful. These are now known as the last Canadian cavalry charges of the First World War. Although not completely successful in achieving their objectives, they did manage to gain ground and hold it against the enemy counterattacks, and in doing so saved hundreds of Canadian soldiers' lives. And oddly enough, the next day, on the 11th of October, the Germans did their final counterattack with tanks, which we would not see until the Second World War. And on that day, it was the very first time the Canadians actually come up against tanks, and we were actually able to hold them off. What you see before you now is they're going to practice doing the skill at arms. They're going to go through it slowly. The horses, I can see, are actually not cooperating quite as much as they had hoped. But the idea here is by going through it slowly, the horse will get accustomed to the routine, the route, and eventually the rider will be able to do it much faster. It might be the fact that we've got a number of people standing in the stands, which they are not quite used to. So doing this type of movement, the rider brings the sword forward, points it at the chest of the target, and that's all he does. He allows the horse's speed and momentum to push the sword into the target. In this case here, he's trying to put it into a 2-inch circle. If he actually hits the circle, he would actually hit the enemy rider in the chest. But the aim is for him to have much more control over the horse, his body, and his arms, so he's able to put the sword through the circle itself. It's actually a very difficult maneuver to do, especially at this pace here, because the horse is actually moving up and down in a very unsteady movement. You are moving up and down unsteadily, and your arm as well. And you've also got to take into account the fact that your horse is breathing, your horse is nervous, and as well you are breathing. So you've got a whole bunch of factors to take into account. So I think in that last one, Andy managed to get one onto his sword. So as he rides through the target, the target goes down the sword, and he drops it, and then prepares for the next target. There we go, Jigs did it. So you'll notice each time they go against the target, the rider has to try and get his horse as close as possible to the target, and then all he has to do is point at it. But the horses, obviously with the crowd, they get nervous, as you can see here. In times of war, these types of horses would be almost immune to anything that we could do to them around here because they're used to explosions, bullets flying by, horses falling, and so on. And that's Ted Goff. Got 2 in a row. Well done, Ted. So of these riders, believe it or not, all 3 are veterinarians. They are all retired, and they do this in their spare time. They put up with myself and the Troop Sergeant, Steve Hartwick. They're doing things that they've never experienced before in their life, which is quite interesting for them and a challenge for us, especially working with civilians. Being in the military, you expect people to do things a certain way. These guys bring the best out of us, and we work very well together. So let's see how he does. So if you notice around their chest, they're carrying ammunition belts. Each bandolier pouch carries 10 rounds of 303 Lee Enfield ammunition. So on their body, they'll be carrying 90 rounds. Going into combat, they would actually carry an extra belt of ammunition around their horse's neck. And on the rifle, they would have 10 rounds. So you're looking at about 190 rounds on the soldier's body when he goes into combat. The equipment you see being used, all are original, all are from the First World War period. The swords are the 1908 pattern that the Canadian Cavalry used in combat. And a lot of them would have been painted green for that duration of the war, but these ones here are ceremonial swords, but they are original from the period. The lance you see being used is 9 feet long. It is heavy, it is a cumbersome weapon, and takes a lot of practice to use. It is a solid bamboo lance. It weighs about 5 pounds and has an awkward center of balance, and especially when the horse is at the trot, it's moving up and down quite significantly. Okay, we'll do one more ride through with the riders, see if they're able to achieve their objective, and then we'll have to call it to allow the ceremony to carry on. So in combat, if you notice on the left-hand side of the rider, you will see there is a sword that is hanging from the horseshoe wallet. That is where they carry the sword. And on the right-hand side, they would have a rifle bucket where they would carry the 303 Lee Enfield. All right. Well done, Ted. Oh, if you didn't see that at the very end, we had a bit of styrofoam, which represented a tent peg, and Ted was able to hit it. It represents a soldier on the ground, and the accuracy of the lance, if it can get something like that, it's about an inch and a half wide. He's doing pretty good. He hit it, but he was not able to spear it. Okay, we'll call this the last go-through for Ted and Jigs. Andy and Jigs. Ted, if you can stand down. So you notice the unique way that Andy is putting the sword, he's turning the hilt of the sword upwards. What that does is actually provide protection for the rider's face as he goes in against the enemy, and the enemy's sword or lance is coming towards you. The idea is that their sword or lance would glance off the hilt, and then you're able to thrust through with the target. As I said, sometimes horses have a mind of their own. Okay, we will stop there. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the Canadian Light Horse and the First Hussars, thank you for listening. And hopefully next time we'll get them all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. How about that horsemanship, ladies and gentlemen? A fabulous example of excellence in motion and skill at arms. Thanks to First Hussars. And now, ladies and gentlemen, before we do the last post, a minute's silence, the lament, and the rouse, I'll call upon Padre Bill White of Legion Zone A6 to lead us in a prayer of thanksgiving. Padre White.
Which one do you want? As we are, let us pray. We join in thanking you, O God, for this land in which we live, the blessings of which we so often take for granted. Open our eyes to see and appreciate the price that was paid for it. Let us never assume that we can have anything for nothing, but sustained by our faith in your goodness, may hope with sure confidence that we may play our part without hesitation and share in the glory you have prepared for those who are faithful unto death. We pray in thy most holy name and say together, Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the last post, followed by a minute of silence, the lament, and the rouse. Bugler Dave Cunningham will be playing the bugle that his grandfather played at Vimy Ridge in April of 1917. Our piper will be Eileen Robertson. Dave? Padre White will now lead us in the act of remembrance. Padre White.
We think of those who never returned. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
I'll now call upon Mary Page St. Ange to lead us in God Save the Queen. By the way, Mary Page is a vocal major at Western University. Mary Page.
God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's show our appreciation to vocalist Mary Page and Ireland St. Ange, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Finney and the 1st Hussars Mounted Troop, Padre Bill White, Bugler Dave Cunningham, Piper Eileen Robertson, and our wonderful color party from HMCS Prevost. And finally, all those who had a hand in organizing this event. Thank you all for your support today. It's pretty cold out here, actually, isn't it? And the rain has held off, Padre White, as I suspected it would.
I'm in sales, not operations.
Right. Okay, before we march off the colors, let me ask you to be sure to check out the annex and the patio, the grandstand area, and to visit the different military displays that are out here today. Take a moment to view the table set for the unknown soldier inside, and pause in memory of those who paid the supreme sacrifice for our freedom. Finally, don't forget to take part in the Parkwood Veterans Raffle set up in the main lobby. Each item was handmade by our Parkwood veterans. We're hoping we'll see you on Remembrance Day, and have a great evening, everybody. Color party, march off the colors.
Quick, march. Field.
Thanks, everybody, for your attention. We'll see you all inside. Dismissed.
Very good, sir. Awesome singing. Yes, very nice. Very good.